Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Hey friends, we are at the Worldview Matters Conference, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Delta Hotel. Alex Newman is speaking right now. We've got a great lineup for you today and tomorrow. Thanks so much for your support.
Thank you guys so much for being here. It's a great honor. I know many of you, and just really grateful. Thank you, Dave, for that kind introduction and for all that you guys all do for the Lord. Normally I like to start with my talks with jokes, but unfortunately there are no ways to make this funny. The reality is a communist, a sorcerer, a bunch of weirdos, and a super capitalist walked into a bar and decided they were going to dumb down all our children and turn them against God. And it's not funny because it's true. And we've got the smoking gun evidence that it happened. So Dave this morning and I were texting back and forth, like, what should I talk about? And he's like, oh, just pray, let the Holy Spirit lead you. He's like, okay. I wrote back, I was like, are you sure? Here's some ideas. And he didn't answer, so I was like, okay, I guess I better do this. I'm praying, and I just felt like I needed to talk about what they're doing to our children. And then maybe 2 hours later, Dave texts, he's like, why don't you do education? I mean, if you're up for it. It's like, all right, confirmation. So we're going to talk about this. The reality is, folks, they are trying to turn our children against God, and they are using this system that masquerades as an education system to do it. And the last long conversation I had with Charlie Kirk, he actually hit the nail on the head about this very issue. So I want to share with you this last conversation that we had. This threat that we're facing is one of the most significant threats in American history. Talk to us about it, and how do we beat it?
Yeah, I think the threat is demonic in its core.
So the threat is demonic, and I will prove to you today that the threat is, in fact, demonic at its core, beyond any shadow of a doubt. Even a non-believer would have to conclude this by the time we're done. And I asked him to dig a little bit deeper. Listen to what he said. You and I both see education as one of the key issues, but how do we prevent them from capturing the minds and the hearts of the next generation so that we ultimately can stop this?
Yeah, you do a great job, and I have a lot to learn from you, and our educators love you, and Dr. Herzberg Hutz thinks you do a great job. Look, I'm not an expert, but I know enough, having visited over 150 colleges and having been in the space. We have the whole premise of education wrong.
The whole premise of education wrong. And he'll dig down a little bit deeper here.
You see, the modern education project is Prussian in its core. At its core, it is focused on administrative state, administrative bureaucracy to try to make a population more subservient and obedient. The form of education that we should be embracing is the classical form of education that is rooted in what is good, true, and beautiful, or what is eternal rather than what is temporal. And we talk about this in the book. The immediate way that we stop it, what is happening in the country when it comes to education, is we must have a renaissance and a revival of homeschooling in this country. That is the first thing, is that we must continue to see that expansion. We must have more and more parents that are unafraid to homeschool their children. And then secondly, understand the government has no role in education. I know that's a radical statement to say, but
it's true. Okay, read your Bible. Show me the chapter and verse that says the government ought to be educating our children, that Caesar ought to be discipling our children. You won't find it because it's not in there. And I started with Charlie Kirk because I believe he was murdered precisely because he was speaking these truths. If he wasn't irritating the devil and his minions, he'd still be walking around doing whatever all the rest of the talking heads on TV do. That's why they came after him. Now, we know, because the Bible teaches, that there is a such thing as doctrines of demons. We know there are demons. We know they have doctrines. And what I intend to prove to you today is that those very doctrines of demons are being taught to about 90% of our children today, if not more. Now, I want to start off with a real simple litmus test that our Lord gave us. Very plain, very unambiguous. You're either with him or you're against him. Okay, notice there's no middle ground. There's no like, well, let's wait and see. There's no neutral territory at all here. This applies to people, institutions, anything else you could think of. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, are the institutions that are spending 12 or more years with our children with God or against him? Yes, absolutely. Jesus also says in Luke chapter 6 that students are not greater than their teacher. The student who's fully trained will become like the teacher. So it behooves us to know something about the teacher. Now, there are wonderful men and women in the system, and I mean no offense to them. They're doing what they can in a wicked system. But the system itself is literally demonic, and I know that offends some people, but it's true, so I'm going to say it. We see the fruit of this. 70% of my generation now identifies as socialist. If you want to know really what socialism means, just take what the Bible teaches and flip it upside down. Okay? Everything that God teaches, you flip it upside down, you have socialism, communism. It's demonic to the core. Right? And yet 70% of millennials, and it's always embarrassing to admit you're a millennial because people assume you're an idiot for obvious reasons. I don't take offense. 70% are now fully in this camp. When you look at the biblical worldview, it's even worse. Less than half of millennials identify as Christians anymore today. And if you dig down a little bit further into that 48% of millennials who say they're Christian, only 6% of millennials have a worldview that can be defined as biblical. In other words, they see the world through a biblical lens. And now this is down from virtually 100% before the government took over education. Virtually everybody had a biblical worldview, even the non-Christians. Okay? They still saw the world through a biblical lens. They understood history through a biblical lens. They understood science through a biblical lens, even if they weren't Christian. Today, younger generations, Generation Z, 4% have a biblical worldview. We're headed very rapidly to 0%. That's their objective. Okay? And they're not even hiding it anymore. They think your kids belong to them.
Look, these aren't, we always talk about these children. They're not someone else's children. They're our children.
Actually, no, they're not. Mr. Biden, stop sniffing the kids. They are not your children, okay? They belong to God. God put them in my home, and so my wife and I will be responsible for the raising and upbringing and education of these children. What we're dealing with here is a war on God, a war on Christianity, a war on the Word of God. But I want to give you a real quick sketch of how we got here, because there was a time in America where education was entirely grounded in the Bible. The first ever law that was ever passed in what would become the United States in North America was the Old Deluder Satan Act. This was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1647. The Pilgrims said, hey, that old deluder Satan wants to deceive you. And one of his chief projects to accomplish that is to keep men from knowledge of the Scriptures. Therefore, they said, everybody in this colony is going to learn how to read. And they said that's parents' job to teach their children how to read. But in big enough towns, just in case parents fail in their duty, we're going to appoint a person to make sure that all the children have learned how to read. Okay? The reason why they needed to learn how to read wasn't so they could get a good job or make lots of money or buy a BMW or retire in Florida. It was so they could read the Word of God so that Satan would not deceive them. Okay? These people started a great university, or at least a formerly great university called Harvard. And people always laugh when I say it was a great university. Like, it was a long time ago. Okay. This was their original rules and precepts. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to get a good job, make lots of money, and retire in Florida. It's to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Can you imagine saying that today? Their old motto used to be truth for Christ and the church. Now they shortened it just to truth. And that's awkward because they don't believe in truth, right? You have your truth, I have my truth. They're going to have to get rid of that too. I don't know what they'll call it, anti-truth. But this is the roots of American education right here. It was all for the glory of God. Even the non-biblical texts that were used in education were thoroughly saturated in Scripture. This is how they used to teach young people to read in this country. You could get it at the general store for a nickel. You had the New England Primer, and then later that was replaced by the Blueback Speller. And what you'll notice is you're learning your letters, the A, you learn the sound of the letters, and then you learn your theology while you're doing it. A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, thy life to mend, this book, the Bible, attend. Isn't that great? Everything they did revolved around the Holy Scriptures that God delivered to us. Can you imagine bringing a Bible into a school today? Treat it like an AK-47. You can't have that in here. What's going on? You're going to be fired immediately. Okay. 20% of children in government schools today, according to the government's own numbers, are being sexually abused. They're facing sexual misconduct from their own faculty. But you can't fire them. But oh boy, you tell the kids about Jesus. Watch how fast they throw you out of there. Right? Now, we used to have a really good education system before the government took it over. A Frenchman came over in 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, and wrote a wonderful book about our country. He said every citizen receives the elementary notions of human knowledge. He's taught the doctrines and evidences of his religion, the history of his country, the leading features of its constitution. Notice he says every citizen. We didn't have one single public school in America at that time. And yet every citizen, he said, was learning these essential things. He said it's extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon. And it's exactly backwards today, isn't it? You find somebody who's even remotely acquainted with these things, and you say, you must be homeschooled. And we all know it's true. Right? How did that happen? right? The government was supposed to educate us, and we're dumber than we've ever been before. Amazing. Okay, now it wasn't all homeschooling, although homeschooling was the majority of education back then. But by 1776, if you would go to the big cities in America, every major denomination of Christianity was operating its own school system. Not like today where you warehouse the kids for 8 hours a day and teach them nonsense, segregate them by age. But every major Christian denomination had its own school system where parents could send children for free if they didn't have money. So notice, parents were in charge. The church stepped in where parents couldn't do it. Then this guy comes along, Robert Owen. Okay, he was real popular back in his day, early 1800s. He was very wealthy. There was little Owenite communities all across the country, his little disciples. And he was a communist before Karl Marx even came along, before communism was cool. And he wrote a bunch of essays about how to reform society. But I want to give you some insight into his thinking. He claimed that his mission in life was to combat what he described as this trinity of the most monstrous evils. That's what he was fighting, the trinity of the most monstrous evils. The trinity of the most monstrous evils, he said, was private property. Whose idea was private property, by the way? Does anybody know? It was God's. Yeah, when he said, "Thou shalt not steal," he established a right to private property. Absurd and irrational systems of religion, by which he meant Christianity. That was the second element of this monstrous trinity. And then the last element was marriage. Family. Okay? So we need to get rid of marriage. Children should be raised by the collective. We'll have a communist utopia. And in his defense, he actually tried out these ideas. Not far from here, he set up a commune called New Harmony in Indiana. And in less than 2 years, the whole thing fell apart because communism is ridiculous. It flies in the face of what God teaches us about human nature, about divine order, about family, about how the economy should run, and so it doesn't work. But he concluded the reason it didn't work was because these children had been raised by Christian parents in what he considered to be an individualistic society, and so the solution was to have the government start educating children. He didn't use the term, but he wanted to create what the Soviets later called the new Soviet man. Right? If we could just get them when they're really young, we can have a blank slate to write on, and we'll make them good little collectivists. Okay? Now, his idea for creating these government schools was not very popular in America, as you might imagine. We were the best educated people that had ever existed in the history of humanity anywhere in the world. Why would we want to change that? Right? Again, show me the chapter and verse. Why should the government educate our children? But he wrote these crazy essays, and they came into the possession of the Prussian ambassador, a man called Baron Jacobi from Prussia. And you heard Charlie Kirk allude to this briefly. The Prussian ambassador took him back to the dictator, Frederick William III. And Frederick William III, according to Robert Owen's autobiography, so much approved of these ideas that the government should educate children that he ordered his interior minister to create the first ever system of education, put that in air quotes, of the state, by the state, and for the state. Okay? He also, we'll come back to that, he also set up a secret society in the United States of America. We know about it because there was a whistleblower named Orestes Brownson. He became a Roman Catholic, defected from this secret society, and wrote a whole book exposing it. He said it was modeled on the Carbonari of Europe, a vile group of people based out of Italy. He said their main objective here was to have the government take over education. He said he was organizing New York. That's how he knew of the operations of this secret society. And he said they wanted to get rid of marriage, right? Pretty interesting. The three enemies to worldly happiness were held to be religion, marriage, family, and private property. Once we got rid of these institutions, he said, we may soon realize an earthly paradise. Okay? This is what he's exposing about this crazy secret society. And so he said they were trying to shift public opinion so that Americans would support the idea that the government should at least play a little role in the education of our children. And he said they were trying to get men elected to legislatures who would support this idea that the government should start getting involved in education. But the great object, he says, was to get rid of Christianity. That was the reason they were doing this, was to destroy Christianity. Now, we know the gates of hell will never prevail against the church. Praise the Lord for that. But these guys didn't know that. They thought if we could just have the government brainwash all the kids, maybe we could get rid of that silly Christianity, right? And he says, hey, we weren't going to make open attacks on religion, although we might belabor the clergy, bring them into contempt where we could. But we wanted to establish a system of state, we said national schools, from which all religion would be excluded, in which nothing would be taught but such knowledge as is verifiable by the senses, and to which all parents would be compelled by law to send their children. You know, today that's normal. Well, of course the government's got to force me to send my kids. That was very radical at that time. There was no state in the Union. In fact, there was no government in the world other than Prussia that had a law compelling parents to hand their children over for alleged education. Okay. Now, here's something really interesting about Robert Owen. He told us where he was getting his ideas from. In 1857, he convened a conference. It was called the Congress of the Advanced Minds of the World, and he admitted that he was getting his ideas from his spirit friends. He says, this great change, the wonder of all nations and peoples, will be effected through the medium of, to the many, strange and yet little understood spiritual manifestations. You can read all his speech. It's fascinating. I encourage you to read his speech. And he goes into great lengths to explain why you can really trust these spirits. You know, they're very trustworthy. They want what's best for humanity. He says, there are spirits now around us and about us, spirits who through the aid of superior intelligence and power have been purified and perfected, who are now deeply interested in forming and carrying forward certain various measures in different parts of the world to bring this great and glorious change for humanity. So he's talking to his spirit friends. That's where he's getting his kooky ideas from. Notice they're all contrary to what God tells us in His Word. It's not a coincidence. And again, we don't have time to get into this whole goofy speech, but I encourage you to read it when you have a chance. It says, I've received communications from various influences calling themselves spirits of departed friends and relatives. He talks about how he was using Ouija boards to talk to them. And if you haven't been in the Old Testament lately, I just want to remind you, Leviticus 19:31, do not turn to mediums and necromancers. Okay? Thereby make yourselves unclean. Man or woman who is a medium or a necromancer shall surely be put to death. Old Testament, the Hebrews, that's how seriously God took this. Do not be talking to dead people. And by the way, they're not even really dead people, right? They're demons. Okay? You go to Deuteronomy chapter 18, God puts this in the same category as sacrificing your children to demons. Okay? That's how bad of an idea this is. And yet the guy who came up with the idea that the government ought to educate our children got his ideas from his conversations with little spirit friends. So this took root in Prussia, as I mentioned. A very interesting system. The government forced everybody to send their children. The government operated the schools. The government trained the teachers. The government segregated the children by age, regardless of their interests, regardless of their abilities, and forced them all to learn basically obedience to the state über alles. And of course that eventually became Germany, and within a few generations they're goose-stepping around, putting Jews in camps. It did not work out well for them, and it won't work out well for anybody. Okay? So how did this system come to America? Well, here's the man right here. You've undoubtedly heard his name. Every little town in Hamilton, America has got a Horace Mann Elementary, Horace Mann High School. Okay, some of you who've got education degrees know exactly what I'm talking about. So Horace Mann, he studied the Prussian system and he absolutely loved it. He says, and in his defense, he admitted that the Prussian dictatorship was vile and ruthless and that they were using this system to brainwash the kids to be good little slaves. But he said, hey, if a dictatorship can do it, we in America, we're more enlightened. We could use it for good things. Well, when you defy God's instructions, you're not going to use it for good things. Okay, but he got himself appointed to be the first ever Secretary of Education of any state that had ever, no state had ever had a Secretary of Education, believe it or not. So he gets this job, gets his buddies in the legislature to appoint him as Secretary of Education, and right away starts setting up these government brainwash camps, schools all over the state. And by 1852, he actually convinces legislators to force parents to hand over their children. There are credible reports that they had to call out the militia to force some of these families to hand over their kids. Like, no, you can't have our children. Thank you very much. We're teaching them fine here. Plus, we need their help on the farm. No, you can't have our kids. So they called out the militia. Now, he wasn't quite as brazen as Robert Owen was. I'm still looking for evidence that he was connected to the little secret society Owen started, although by nature it's hard to track secret societies. But we know some of what he believed. He thought government education would equalize all men. He wanted to get the Bible out of the schools, which was absolutely ridiculous at that time to people. What do you mean, get the Bible out? What are you going to teach from if you don't have the Bible? Like, are you crazy? So he didn't succeed in that. But his argument was, well, we got Presbyterians and Anglicans and Baptists, and we don't want them arguing over predestination in the classroom. So why don't we just leave that for Sunday, and the schools will focus on the 3 R's. Okay. We'll teach them for 5 days that if God exists, he's completely irrelevant to everything. Okay. What could go wrong? Right. So obviously they didn't succeed in that. It wasn't until the 1860s that they finally succeeded in getting the Bible out. But anyways, he promoted this nationwide. He said, we who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. Sorry, but no, we didn't give you hostages. You forced us to hand our children over. We didn't give you any hostages, okay? Now, we don't know exactly what his beliefs were. He described himself sometimes as a Unitarian, heretical sect that denied the Trinity and eventually moved into communism very quickly. I mean, if you go to your local Unitarian church, you know what I mean. Right? Pride flags everywhere. But his wife, Mary Peabody man, was talking to spirits. She was part of the Transcendentalist Club. Her and her sister, big time communicating with little spirit friends, okay? And so when Horace Mann was done, and I could talk for hours on Horace Mann. He's the one who brought us the illiteracy crisis. The reason everybody could read back then, and only half of us can read today according to the federal government's data, goes back to Horace Mann. Story for another day. I just want to focus on the spiritual side of this. But so after he's done in Massachusetts, he starts traveling the country like an evangelist, preaching the good news of salvation by government school. He says we could get rid of 90% of the crimes if we could just have the government educate people. You guys been to Chicago lately? Obviously it worked. Right? Wait a minute here. By their fruit ye shall know them. Right? It's been a disaster. It's been an utter disaster. But he convinced a lot of legislatures to do this. Connecticut, New York. Eventually, after the Civil War, they started forcing this on the southern states. And pretty soon, by the early 1900s, almost every state in America had a compulsory government-run indoctrination system masquerading as a school system. Okay. So now we're going to fast forward to John Dewey. We're going to skip a lot of history. But John Dewey, I mentioned the communist who walked into the bar, joined forces with a super capitalist. He's the communist. He literally was. He didn't go to Prussia. He went to the Soviet Union to study their marvelous system. He was so impressed by how the Soviet schools were instilling a collectivistic mentality in the minds of the children. Some of you who have an education degree know exactly who I'm talking about. But you were taught he was all about democracy. And democracy, my foot. Okay? Soviet-style democracy. But I want to focus on his religion, not his kooky ideas about education. Because he was a religious guy. Right? Just not in the sense that normal people would recognize. Okay? He and his buddies, they thought they were so clever they were going to start a new religion. And they did. They wrote the Humanist Manifesto. And I encourage you to read it. You can go get it on your favorite search engine. Don't use Google because Google is evil. Today they call it Humanist Manifesto 1 because they've released subsequent editions. But if you read it, you'll find out that the religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. It's the first tenet of their new religious manifesto. Now, if you've been reading your Bible lately, you're probably thinking about this. Hey, wait a minute. What does God say? Well, the very first words in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's a free country. You can believe any kind of dumb, false religion you want to here. I don't recommend it. I mean, eternity depends on it. But this was the religion of the guy who took control of the government school system and used it to brainwash our kids. Now, you should keep reading it. It's monstrous. It's basically communism dressed up as a religion. One of his buddies who signed his religious manifesto, Charles Francis Potter, he wrote in his book, Humanism, A New Religion, that education is the most powerful ally of humanism. Every public school will be a school of humanism. What is your theistic Sunday school going to do, teaching just some of the children for 1 hour a week against 5 days of humanistic teachings? And it was a rhetorical question. They knew the answers. Nothing. Right? That's why 80% of Christian children from Christian homes today are leaving the faith and leaving the church. What is your 1 hour of Sunday school going to do against 5 days of humanistic teachings? They know the answer. Get a copy of their goofy magazine, The Humanist. The classroom is the arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity and the new faith of humanism. See, they understand. The pagans and the godless, they don't send their children to Christian schools, but the Christians send their children to the pagan godless schools. Now let's think about this humanist religion for just a minute longer. Okay. There is no God, therefore I am God. Therefore you are God. There is no objective right and wrong because there's no God to define right and wrong. Therefore we get to determine what is good and evil. Is this starting to sound familiar? Yeah. Genesis chapter 3. It's the oldest lie in the book. It's like literally what Satan said to Eve. Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. That's tempting, isn't it? We can be gods? Ooh. Maybe if we teach enough of the children that, right? So obviously it took a long time before this became the established religion of the United States, but it did. 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that we could not have prayer in our government brainwash schools anymore. 1963, no more Bible. Sorry, guys. I know it's the foundation of everything, right? Colossians tells us that Christ is the foundation of all sound knowledge and wisdom, but save that for Sunday school. Okay, can't have any of that stuff in your school. No more Bibles. Okay. Has anybody read the First Amendment, by the way? It says Congress shall make no law. Congress didn't make any laws respecting establishment religion. We're talking about a school district in Pennsylvania. We're talking about the state of New York. By the way, when the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of the states had established churches. Clearly, the founders weren't talking about banning prayer in the Bible from school. In fact, Congress printed the first Bibles in America. But Justice Potter Stewart, who wrote the dissent in this ridiculous case, said this refusal to permit religious exercises is not the realization of state neutrality, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism, or humanism, as John Dewey and his friends would have called it. So under the guise of the First Amendment, prohibiting the establishment of a national religion, the Supreme Court established a national religion. And they forced us to pay for the propagation of this false religion from the pit of hell. And even worse than that, they forced us to have our children indoctrinated to believe this false religion. And you can see the fruit all around us, right? I mean, and we can't deny it. A poll just came out of California. 94% of the children in California today report mental health problems. 94%! The CDC's data shows 10% of our young people tried to kill themselves just last year. And they're coming into schools and shooting each other. They're taking drugs. They don't know what bathroom to go in. They're identifying as cats. I'm serious. They want litter boxes to pee in the bathroom. This is what happens when you establish a false religion and you teach it to multiple generations of children. Everything goes haywire. That's how we ended up in this mess. And they're very good at discrediting their parents. You know, I'll unbrainwash my child when he comes home from school. I got this. We'll have dinner every night. We'll teach them to not believe anything that they learned, and everything's going to be fine. See, so I actually went through this, so I have a little bit of experience. I was in 9th grade. I was living in Brazil at the time, going to a very fancy-pantsy private school. And my 9th grade geography teacher said, all right, class, everybody get into little groups, and sit around a table. We're going to do an exercise, a thought exercise, values clarification. So the teacher says to us, all right, guys, you're all on a ship, and now the ship is sinking. Oh, isn't that bad? Now you all jump off into the life rafts. But now your table jumped into a life raft, but you've got one too many people in your life raft. You've exceeded the carrying capacity of your life raft. So you got a doctor, you got a lawyer, you got a teacher, you got a nurse, you got an engineer in your life raft. Who are you going to kick out? Who are you going to murder so that everybody else can continue floating? And I think we all know the answer. It's very obvious. The lawyer. Just kidding. There are decent lawyers, I'm sure, somewhere. Sorry to the lawyers in here. I'm not making fun. Yeah, it's funny to make fun of lawyers until you need one, right? Then you're in trouble. So what happens here, right? What happens here? What happens here is what happened to me. Well, Mom and Dad said we shouldn't murder people. In fact, the pastor said that too. The Bible said, didn't God say that we shouldn't murder? How silly are they? I can't believe they never thought of this. The only moral and ethical solution here is obviously to murder somebody. Man, my parents, my pastor, my Bible, that's garbage. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm smarter than them. You know, these people brag that in 15 minutes they can undo what parents have tried to instill in the minds of their children over 15 years. That's how sophisticated they have gotten with this. So in an instant, parents are discredited, pastor is discredited, Bible is discredited. Now the child thinks he's smarter than you, and he is convinced that morality is a social construct. There's just many shades of gray. There's no right and wrong. Maybe it's okay to kill babies. We'll just dehumanize them by calling them clumps of cells. Right? Maybe it's okay to kill older people. I mean, after all, there's not enough resources for all of us, right? That's where this is leading, folks. That's exactly where this is leading. And they're very proud of how they're doing this to our children. This is Dr. Shirley McCoon. She was hired by George H.W. New World Order Bush to start bringing in the nationalization of our education system. Listen to what she said to all 50 of our state governors in 1989.
And fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society.
A total restructuring of society? Did anybody vote for this? No, me neither. Okay. Now here's how they're using the schools to bring this about.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of schools.
the social change function of school. We're going to anticipate the future. We'll break out the crystal ball and the tea leaves and the tarot cards, and we'll know what we need in the future, and then we'll use the social change function of schools to prepare your children for it. You know where she's getting her ideas from, by the way? She wrote a book about it. You can buy it on Amazon. It's called The Light Shall Set You Free, and she's talking to her spirit friends. Yeah. You should read the book. Hey, her spirit friends are very wise. They're bringing us into a new age, a fifth dimension. You know what's holding us back from this glorious new age? You people. Clinging to your guns and your Bible, right? How dare you, bigots. Right? Hey, read her book. Read her book, okay? So I want to show you how this works, because they're very, very good at this now. Back in the early 1990s, sodomy was still a crime across most of our states. Some of you still remember those days. If I had told you we'd soon be celebrating homosexual marriages, you would have laughed. You might have called the guys with the white lab coats and the rubber rooms. Okay, homosexual marriage, all right. But they were preparing our children. They started showing a documentary in classrooms all across the country, 1991, 1992, 1993, called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. Of course, gay means happy, but gay sounds better than homosexual. So, but here's a little clip from that video so you can see what your children and your grandchildren have been exposed to.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
I don't see why they shouldn't.
Yeah, I don't see why they shouldn't, right? And all the kids agree. I mean, when you put it that way, I don't see why they shouldn't either. What if you told them the truth? What if you told them that marriage was a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church? What if you told them that marriage was the first institution that God ordained for the purpose of bringing more image bearers into the world? They might not have come to that same conclusion, right? But notice what he said. Pretend judges. Put on your pretend judge hat. Okay. They thought about this. You remember what the lady said? Shirley MacCoon? Got to think about what we need in the future. They knew they weren't going to get the bitter clingers to go for them. I mean, they asked California to vote on this. You remember the land of fruits and nuts and flakes? Hey, what do you guys think about homosexual marriage? Now we're good. Yeah, God's definition is adequate. Thank you very much. They couldn't even get this passed in California. But they brainwashed a big enough percentage of our young people to think that pretend judges could just do the right thing and overturn this mean old bigoted system. So they're very good at this. And I could show you 100 examples just like this. They're doing it right this moment. They're preparing your children for a totalitarian global system based on these doctrines of demons. Okay? Now we're here. A few years ago, yep. They call it Drag Queen Story Hour. You go to their website, they brag. We're at government schools all over the country. Okay. Now they got something they call social emotional learning. Some of you have heard of that. Social emotional. It's all the rage, right? The NEA says it's the heartbeat of what happens in the classroom today. So the main group pushing this is called CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Socio-Emotional Learning. And they say that what they're doing is you're using these SEL competencies to develop global citizens. So I started digging into this about a decade ago, and I went to the history tab for CASEL. CASEL is, again, the main organization pushing this, funded by Bill Gates of hell and the Rockefellers and the rest of the clown car. And on their history tab, right on their website, they said that both CASEL and the term socio-emotional learning came from a meeting in 1994 from the Fetzer Institute. It's not that far from here. Some of you might have heard of it. It's a New Age center of occultism where, of course, they are talking to their spirit friends. Okay? And they brag about it. They recite Alice Bailey's prayers and all the rest of it. So I want to show you the main lady involved in this. Her name is Linda Lantieri. She's a professor of education at Teachers College at Columbia University, the most important college of education in the world. Listen to what she says.
Courses like this are rooted in social and emotional learning, or SEL for short, a style of teaching that was pioneered by Linda Lantieri.
I did not imagine that I would be living to see some SEL in 92% of the nation's schools.
That's a lot more than 92% now. Unfortunately, it's even in the Christian schools in some cases. They call it Christian SEL, and they sprinkle a Bible verse on top, right?
I knew that if we didn't add the spiritual dimension to this work, we were going to leave kids with not all they needed to know. And the Fetzer Institute is really poised right now to step up in supporting this movement.
Fetzer understands that a basic science to establish the natural spirituality of the child presented a blueprint for building a new system of education. The people of Fetzer walk the walk.
A new system of education based on spirituality. It's exciting. You know where they're getting their ideas from? I'll let her explain. Here she is on a little webinar. Listen carefully.
I'd like to offer some guiding agreements that hopefully we can all agree to in this next hour and a half that we're spending. And they come from one of my teachers, who, by the way, showed up at my council table, always does. I hate to say she's passed to another dimension because I have regular communication with her.
Talking to your demon friends again. That's where all these bad ideas are coming from, guys. And I could do this all day, right? These people are proud of what they're doing. They're not hiding it. Your fake news won't tell you because they know you'd be mad and you might take your children out of these things, but they're open about it. They think they're doing the right thing. They think their spirit friends are giving them great ideas on creating a new system of education based on the natural spirituality of the child. What is the natural spirituality of the child, by the way? Anybody read Jeremiah? The heart is desperately wicked. Right? As Bodhi Balcom used to say, you must not have any kids, right? Viper in a diaper, right? Screaming and hollering, the most selfish thing. I got a baby. I can say that. They're great, but oh man. So anyway, that's the natural spirituality of the child. Right? That's why they need parents to teach them the way that they should go so that when they're old, they won't depart from it. Now, the UN actually has an agency that's dedicated to injecting this into every classroom around the world. It's called UNESCO MGIP. It's based in India. I was there last year. They didn't want to talk to me, surprisingly. Here's the three amigos. I'm just going to fly through some of this stuff, guys, because we're not going to have time to finish it all. But communist dictator, and a New Age occultist. These are the three guys and girls who set up this ridiculous UN agency. And they'll tell you what they're doing. Here's one of their webinars we pulled. Listen.
I come from UNESCO MGIP that is based in New Delhi, and we'll be talking to you today about socio-emotional learning and how we feel that this is the key to building global citizenship. My name is Nandini Chatterjee Singh.
Global citizenship. Where have we heard that before? So that's what they're doing, global citizenship. They're very, very openly based in the occult. They're bragging that they're going to brainwash your children into this. The sex ed stuff that UNESCO is putting out. This is their global sex ed standards, by the way. They want 5-year-olds to know about sodomy. That's the kind of stuff the UN says needs to be taught to every child in the world. They're taking them on field trips to mosques. We learn the 5 pillars of Islam. We'll do Buddhism in the classroom. We'll do yoga, Hinduism in the classroom. Here's a teacher training program where they're teaching teachers to help the children summon spirits into the classroom. Watch.
They're watching, ancestors watching, I know. Now call out your ancestors into the room.
Yeah, it's not your ancestors, right? They also have forced children to stand up in front of the classroom and apologize for their Christian privilege. Yeah, true story. In California, they voted unanimously, the State Board of Education, to approve an ethnic studies model curriculum mandatory where elementary school children had to chant praises to the demonic pagan deities of the Aztecs who required a never-ending supply of human hearts chopped out of human sacrifice victims on top of pyramids. Okay. Unanimous approval from the State Board of Education in California. Okay, and now it's going global. I mentioned UNESCO. Literally, at the very beginning, they admitted the purpose was to bring about a one-world government. The first head of UNESCO, you might not be surprised to know, Julian Huxley, was the head of the British Humanist Association, the same demonic religious worldview as John Dewey. He was also the president of the British Eugenics Society, the wackadoodles who believe some races are better than other races, and kind of like Hitler, if we selectively breed people like cows, it'll be nice. Okay. They've told us what they're doing. 1990, they agreed that we need the same standards for all children everywhere when it comes to education. 2000, they said schools must change the attitudes, values, and behaviors of children. This was agreed to by every government in the world. In 2016, their Education Action Plan, again agreed to by all governments in the world, said that this education needs to promote the integrated development of the whole person, including their spirituality. And some of you are thinking, well, that doesn't apply to us. That's just like for third world countries and stuff. Well, here's the Secretary of Miseducation for 7 years under Barack Hussein Obama. Listen.
Hi, I'm Arnie Duncan, U.S. Secretary of Education, and we are so honored that the UN Secretary General has designated the United States as a champion country of the UN Global Education First Initiative.
Oh, we're not just part of this. We are a champion country. Aren't you proud? Okay. So the UN has what they call the World Core Curriculum. It was written by the guy they call the father of global education, Robert Mueller. That's a picture of him right there. And he said it needs to be taught to every child in every school in every country in the world. Someone knows where this is going. Okay? And interesting guy, interesting set of global standards. He admits in the foreword to the teacher's manual for this atrocity that the underlying philosophy upon which it's all based comes from the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Javal Kuhl. And I know that means nothing to most of you, but I'll give you a couple of quick fun facts so you know what it means. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story. They're still around today. They renamed it the Lucius Trust because Lucifer Publishing was just a little bit too obvious. Okay? But it's still around today. They actually designed the prayer room at UN headquarters, which I have seen. Then this Tibetan teacher, turns out he's not Tibetan or a teacher, he's not even a human being. Alice Bailey claimed to be channeling ascended masters, her spirit buddies, who were dictating the content of these books to her. So, you know, if the World Core Curriculum is based on the writings of this lady and her demons, I had to get a copy. So I did. Half of it's indecipherable, incomprehensible gobbledygook, as you'd expect from a demon. But they say in the book that we're laying the foundation for the emergence of a new species of human being, a more highly evolved unit. So much craziness in this. They said world citizenship needs to be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation, a world government, and a world brain. It says the problem is to achieve a synthesis of Marxism and neo-scholasticism, but to get there using the methods of John Dewey. Isn't that interesting? So the idea that education needs to create global citizens so that they're prepared for world federation, world government. I don't suppose the UN's working on that, are they? Here's the Secretary General of the United Abominations right here.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens.
They're telling you to your face what they're doing. Okay. Needs to nurture global citizens. So somebody said Common Core here a second ago. This is where we fit in, right? Back in 2004, Bill Gates of Hells flew over to Paris on his private jet. I'm sure he bought carbon credits from Al Gore, so he's good. But he flew over there and signed a deal with UNESCO to create global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, and the global technology necessary to make it all real. Then he flew back on his private jet. Again, I'm sure he bought carbon credits, so he's good. And he started pouring millions and then billions of dollars into this little thing we know as Common Core. You've probably heard of it. And they were so proud of what they were doing, they actually bought ads to tell you what they were doing. Here's one of the ads that they bought to put on your TV so you'd know how great Common Core really was.
Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone.
They match up against international standards too. They're proud of it. And they're telling you what they're doing. You notice here, Seattle, Chicago, Shanghai, and Paris. All the little slaves around the whole world are going to learn the same garbage at the same time. Now, do you think a slave in China living under the most murderous dictatorship in the history of humanity should be learning exactly the same thing as an American child from a Christian nation based on the principles from the Bible of self-government and private property? I don't think so. But they do. And that's what they're doing, and they'll tell you. Okay, but at least the kids are learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. And you laugh because you know, right? In fact, they brag. They'll tell you that your kids are not learning any of this. Here's the Deputy Secretary of Education just a few years ago showing what the federal government's own data shows about where our children are at.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that two-thirds, get this, two-thirds of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
Less than 1 in 3 of the victims of the government school system are even proficient. And if you knew what proficient meant, you would laugh. It's a joke. Less than 1 in 3 are even proficient in any course. And by the way, you spend $25,000 per child per year, so that less than 1 in 3 of them can be proficient in anything. Okay. I've got 6 children. We homeschool them, and I can tell you, you can teach a child to read in 2 months with virtually no effort. It's fun. It's simple. They could be reading the King James Bible by the time they're 6. It's not rocket science. This is deliberate. It's on purpose. They understand that dumb children are easier to control. So we see them leaving the faith. And I want to just spend our last few minutes here talking about what we do with all of this, because I know it's heavy. I know it's a lot. I know some of us have already been victims of this. I know some of our children have already been victims of this. But it's not too late to start doing the right thing now. So I want to start by we need to rethink all of this. Like, we need to ask some basic questions. And I start by telling people, like, just imagine the school building is on fire and your children are inside, and like you hear them screaming and you smell the flesh burning, and well, what do? Of course, you go lecture the school board. Right? Come on, guys. Do something. Some of you have kids, you're like, wait, what? Like, no, you run in the building and you grab the children and you run out, even if you die in the process. They're your children, for crying out loud. Right? I think we need to think in those terms with that kind of urgency. And honestly, it's worse than a burning building. A burning building is just going to hurt them physically, and that's bad enough. They're castrating your kids, double mastectomies for little girls that they convince to be boys. But it's worse than that. They're destroying your children physically and mentally and morally and spiritually and academically and ethically in every possible way. It's horrific. We got to get them out. Pastors ought to be sounding the alarm about this. Why don't Christians in America know any of these things? Why don't they know what the Bible teaches about these things? Well, we have 52 sermons this year on John 3:16. That's all you need to know. That's not all we need to know, right? Paul says we ought to be preaching the whole counsel of God. God's got a lot to say on education. Deuteronomy 11, Deuteronomy 6 too, tells us we ought to be teaching our children diligently, impressing on their hearts the laws of God, what God has done for us, the nature of God when we wake up in the morning, when we're walking by the way, when we're sitting down to eat, when we lie down to bed at night. All the time we're supposed to be teaching our children. Okay. And I don't think that means everybody in the world needs to homeschool, but I think that's a good benchmark there, and at least give them Christian biblical education. All right, here's my children's favorite Bible verse, Ephesians 6:4. Papa, you're provoking us to anger. It gets recited multiple times a day in my house, but it is what it is. But what are we supposed to do here, parents? We're supposed to bring up our children in the discipline, in the nurture, in the instruction, in the fear of the Lord. That's our job. Oh, but we'll unbrainwash them at dinner. Okay. Now, the Bible also tells, it doesn't give us how many credit hours of science or math might be ideal, but it does tell us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's the foundation, right? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How much fear of the Lord is being instilled in the minds and hearts of our children 5 days a week for 12 years? 0, none, and you all know it's true. So what does that mean? How much wisdom and knowledge are our children getting? None is the correct answer. Math is not my forte, but I can figure that one out. So it's the beginning, and they're getting none of it, then they're getting no knowledge, and they're getting no wisdom. It's even worse. They're getting fake knowledge, fake wisdom that leads to hell, leads to death. Okay? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now, Jesus gave us a nice little test. Right? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. He's talking about taxes here, of course. Right? So how do you know what to give to Caesar? Well, his face is on the coin. His image is on the coin. Whose image is on your children? You better do what he says, right? And again, Luke and Matthew, Jesus says, whoever's not with me is against me. So we need to rethink everything we think we know about education, guys. You should talk to my friends in the back at FreedomProject Academy. It's an online classical K-12 school. It's amazing. I serve on the board there. I taught there for 12 years. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. And I want to share with you this, too, from our friends at Classical Conversations. We think of today the purpose of education. This is what Common Core people say, is to get a good job, career, college, whatever. That's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to know God and make Him known. All right, go back to the Westminster Catechism. What's the main point of your life? Is to glorify God. We need to be doing that through our education. We've got a few books out on the table dealing with this. I've got 3 on education. That's how passionate I am about this. You might have noticed. You can get our newsletter for free. It's at libertysentinel.org/subscribe. We also have a sign-up out back that I put on a paper, so if you want to sign up for that, again, it's free. But I want to encourage you folks, we need to start thinking about how we can get an exodus from this so-called school system. We need Christians in America to leave the system as quickly as we possibly can. I know that's a big project. It's like David and Goliath times 100, right? This is a $1 trillion a year monstrosity that's got its claws in every family, in every community. In a lot of communities, this is the biggest employer. So I realize the enormity of this task. But guess what? My God's bigger than the task. Okay. So a lot of pastors, when I talk to them, oh, we just do the gospel here. You know, we're not interested in education or politics or family, anything. We just do the Great Commission, gospel. Really? Have you read the Great Commission? Jesus commands us, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Did God command us to bring up our children in the fear, discipline, nurture, and admonition of the Lord? Yes, he did. What about making disciples? Like, well, we sent a missionary to Haiti, so we're good, we're covered. We checked that box, right? What about the people that God put in your house, the little people? You don't think you have to disciple them too? I'll tell you what, folks, that's your first ministry. That's your first ministry. Yeah, Haiti, great. We definitely should send missionaries to Haiti and everywhere. But the little people that God put in our house, those should be the ones that we're really focused on discipling. So I want to end here with just one more thing from the scriptures, folks. This is not a battle against flesh and blood. Like Bill Gates of hell and all the rest of the clown car, they could drop dead tomorrow, and Satan would raise up 10 new morons to keep this going. That's not the issue, right? You can vote them out, whatever. It's not a political problem. I mean, there are political dimensions to it, but ultimately it's a spiritual problem. And that's what the Bible teaches clearly. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're up against. Just to be real clear, Satan wants your children. God put you in charge of protecting your children from that, from the world, from the flesh, from the devil, and of raising them up and sending them out like arrows into the world to reach the lost. And if we don't do that, nobody's going to do it for you. Certainly your local school board is not going to do that for you. Nobody loves your children as much as you do. So we have to take this seriously. It's a spiritual battle. Satan is after the hearts and minds of our children, but we can and we must do what needs to be done here. In Psalm 2, we read about the kings of the earth, the rulers conspiring against God and his anointed one, and that sounds pretty intimidating. You can imagine God in heaven. Oh, they're conspiring against me, now what? Now, if you keep going, that's right, God laughs at these people. He's laughing at them. And in verse 5, it says he's going to speak to them in his wrath. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that. So thank you guys, and God bless you.